It says go, it goes. But good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you're from. Welcome to another podcast by Chris and Tim on the OSINT Output.
I'm in Chris.
There you go. That one too. Today we're talking to a fascinating individual as we're going through his background, because as Chris and I do, we don't stalk our guests, we conduct OSINT. I think we've said that quite a few times. And stalking this individual will be hard because he's a whole world away from us. But how we got in touch was pretty fascinating. Someone reached out to me on LinkedIn from his company and said, "Hey, can we come on your podcast? We love it." And I was like, "Sure, we love to have every OSINT person on here that we can get on." So we want to welcome Aaron Dixon. Aaron, welcome.
Thank you. Very, very nice to sit down, have a chat, discuss topics, and engage.
So, Aaron, if you could tell us a little about your background as an open source investigator and your experience and education getting into the field, so you can go all the way back to when you first joined college or the military,
Yeah.
or we can just go up for the past few years.
Yeah. So I'll go back a few years because I think my particular journey is interesting in a couple of ways, if I am allowed to say that about myself. So my background is I grew up in New Zealand. I eventually, after high school, went to university and failed miserably. I was always interested in history. Through friends of mine, I became interested in philosophy, but I never really applied that. I didn't succeed. I joined the military. I started doing officer training, went through that, and I was required to take a university paper. It was the rather attractively named An Introduction to the History of Modern Warfare. And that's when I became a little bit more aware of really the particulars of military history, about intelligence, about the mechanisms that operate behind it, about international security and that type of thing. And I ended up leaving officer training, spent a couple of years in the territorials, and eventually moved overseas. And when I did that, I decided probably now is a good time to get a degree. And so I pursued a degree in history and defense studies, and then eventually pushed through into postgraduate study in international security with a focus on intelligence. Whilst I was studying, whilst overseas, I was working. I ended up getting a job as a consultant, worked in data privacy, especially focusing on the General Data Protection Regulation when that came into effect 2018 throughout Europe. A lot of IoT when IoT was a really, really big topic. So that was quite exciting. And then at the end of my 6 years as a consultant, I started doing digital forensics, copying data, ensuring the integrity of data. And I decided that working as a consultant wasn't super interesting for me, and I would like to move into the open source intelligence field, which I'm sure lots of people have considered, but it's very difficult to break into. So I had this technical background. I had this academic background as well. And eventually I landed on Maltego, and I got a job as a subject matter expert, training people in the utilization of the tools and upskilling. And the reason that I say that this is an interesting kind of course of events is I didn't directly come to open source intelligence through a technical background, rather more academically, through that history, through international security, and through philosophy. So my approach to open source intelligence isn't so much, IP addresses and network infrastructure and malware hashes. It's what is data? What am I looking at? This Sherlock kind of statement of, you look, but you don't see. Those kind of fundamental psychological considerations when dealing with open source intelligence. And that's what I do now. I train people technically to utilize open source intelligence tools, but I force them to listen to me wax lyrical about when I look at something, what am I seeing? How am I interpreting that? What am I bringing to the table from my own past experience or biases? And how am I planning? How am I executing? And I find it an absolutely fascinating topic.
What's your current position at Maltego? What do you do for them?
So I'm broadly speaking a subject matter expert, and my daily role is as an onboarding manager. So I liken it to, as soon as someone has purchased a car, we'll sit down together in said car and we'll discuss how the car works. We'll go for a drive. It's my job to develop a fundamental level of understanding and comprehension for our customers, utilizing our tools so that they can work both effectively and efficiently through open source intelligence investigations.
I'd love to get in a whole entire episode on Multigo in the future. One of my favorite softwares. But Chris, your question.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And I've seen some of your webinars, so I kind of have an idea of how you'll answer some of this. But can you talk about the current OSINT landscape and then what you see for the future of OSINT?
Oh, yeah. So we recently wrote a rather long paper on the future of open source intelligence, which is, I think it was about 13 pages long. It could have been 100 pages long, and was certainly our attempt to articulate what we're currently seeing, what we expect to see in the future. But suffice to say, it's wild out there. So the current situation is open source intelligence has seen a massive range of developments in the last 10 or 15 years, whether that's because the nature of data has changed, what kind of data is developed, the formats of data, the accessibility of data has changed, right? We used to have lots of companies that were more than happy to provide us with significant amounts of data free of charge, open access and everything. Now that GDPR regulation has restricted access for, business purposes. Companies themselves have realized that data is value, right? It is a commodity that they want to monetize. But also tooling has exploded, right? Not just because we now have AI-assisted coding and tooling, meaning that anybody who has an idea can essentially develop and deploy a solution, but also because we need specialized tools to access certain types of data, certain corners of the internet, so on and so forth. Obviously, the big item on everybody's lips is AI. This hugely, I hesitate to say beneficial without adding the caveat that there are benefits and there are certain vulnerabilities associated with the utilization of AI, but it's a game changer.
Environment that we all have to deal with.
Yeah, and it's wild because it is so attractive. AI seems to solve so many problems, but it also can be utilized to create many, many other issues. So, I mean, I've been revising some of my notes here, and some of the issues may be that those hallucinations get thrown into investigations. Some of them may be that because AI can articulate in a very fluent manner a conclusion, that one tends to believe that conclusion. Conversely, adversaries can utilize AI to generate massive amounts of noise, disinformation, misinformation. These are commonly listed as the top short-term issue for investigators, for police units, and so on and so forth. So that's the current situation. We're probably going to be sitting for the next couple of years in this fairly tumultuous AI-driven open source intelligence environment, where we essentially try to bring under control those capabilities, mitigate the negatives to the greatest degree possible, and then kind of see what comes out of that. Now, as to what comes out of that, I really have no idea. I think on the ground, we'll see huge amounts of interoperability between the human analyst and these technical automations. Maybe we'll see some pushback against AI. I hope to see some pushback, but the Pandora's box has certainly been opened, so AI will be on the cards for the foreseeable future.
I think as the future builds for OSINT practitioners and investigators, data verification becomes tremendous. And the more AI comes out, the harder, but the more important I think that verification and validation becomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And here's one of the issues that we run into with AI. I maybe you've noticed this in recent years. It's very easy for a piece of data to be profit, a piece of information, or even, dare I say, a piece of intelligence, that processed information, an intelligence product having been derived, that can be disparaged on the basis of merely saying, well, that's AI generated. This is misinformation, right? Fake news, right? And historically, this isn't a new development, by the way. We would say in German, the Lügenpresse, right? The lying press has existed for decades as a concept. But you can say, well, that's AI generated content. Our soldiers didn't shoot those civilians. Our airstrike didn't hit that particular target. Our political leaders didn't say that thing or make that gesture. In terms of verification, in order to counter that statement, a huge amount of time and effort needs to be given to it, right? Analysts need to then sit down, they need to gather the data, they need to consider the metadata attributable to it, they need to corroborate across multiple sources in order to hopefully come to a concrete evaluation of the veracity of that information, and then subsequently release it into the public sphere, where the public is then responsible for hopefully making an informed decision. But it's AI and information verification has just become it's wrestling with the pigs in the mud. It is very difficult, and there's no authority anymore. Like, what is truth? What is the reality? We can disagree all day long about these particular concepts, and it's very difficult for people that have to operate on a daily basis to find truth and deliver that truth to operate in that environment.
If we all just elect more over-the-top politicians, then when the AI comes out and says they did that, it'll just be immediately believable.
Hallucinations have become more terrible because of that, because as we've elected these politicians who have kind of gone above and beyond when it comes to messaging, and they're just retweeting, reposting, resharing things that haven't been validated before, it causes AI to make mistakes. Good example of this, right? DuckDuckGo, under its AI, stated that JD Vance was dead. And that people are no longer, I have been sent multiple screenshots now, not only from my children, from my wife, but from my coworkers, other people I work with in the field. They're no longer sending me a result from a search engine. They're sending me the summary that the search engine is generating, whether it's Google, DuckDuckGo, or Bing. So we're getting into this environment of where adversaries are no longer intentionally creating disinformation for us to ingest as a result of us pushing information into the ether. AI is now producing it for us.
Was he just quietly resting on some living room furniture?
We'll have to read Hillbilly Elegy to find out more.
But that's a fantastic point, though, right? So if you fundamentally look at where the information is being gathered from for these AI models, large language models, if you consider that Reddit is a big contributor, is a big source, then you need to ask yourself what kind of data is being gathered from Reddit. And if it's public sentiment, discussions, hot topics, quote unquote, then there's a huge issue relating to that, because the AI itself is not fact-checking, verifying, corroborating. It's feeling the pulse of what people are talking about. And I don't mean to be disparaging of people on the internet, but there is a tendency of people on the internet to not only discuss absurd topics, but to rather enjoy furthering the discussion on those topics, exacerbating the extent to which they're discussed to the degree of ridiculousness. Thus, you have this basis for your evaluation, which is built upon people being sarcastic and people being facetious on the internet. It's a slippery slope.
Mentioned authority, and one of the things that I want to go towards the older crowd saying this, but I think it's more towards people not understanding how information is being disseminated on the internet. they consider authority their friends. They're like, you know, like I talk to Alice every single day and she's very educated, so she must know what she's talking about. So when she shares something on Facebook, I believe it instantly, right? So authority is no longer someone with the bona fides, the education, the experience, the background. It could be a very trusted source, which is how a lot of disinformation, misinformation gets spread, because it gets spread through usually diaspora among a population. It goes from a niche social media source, maybe something like at some of these subreddits, like specifically Poison AI. I love that subreddit, going on there and checking that one out, because DuckDuckGo, that's where it came from for that one. But it's been very, very difficult teaching not only my family, but some of the students I've had to teach, which you've probably been introduced to it as well, understanding that even though as you look back at the history of this investigator or this organization, they may have at one time spread false information without even knowing it, just simply because they only had one source to go on.
Yeah, it's interesting you said it. It reminds me when we talk about information being thrown out in there in an authoritative manner. You know, this is, by the way, what you're describing is that classic the fallacious reasoning, this argument from authority, whereby someone says, you know, and maybe rightly so, hey, I've studied this for 30 years, I'm an expert on the matter. Sure, you can absolutely state that. This probably implies that you have a better understanding of the context of a particular issue or historical arguments for and against, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your argument is correct. That's a very different question. So yes, when you have an authoritative individual standing up there and making an argument, one inherently believes that the argument must be true. And it reminds me of when Stephen Colbert, if you recall, he had a late night show, the Colbert Report.
Yeah.
He sat down with Bill O'Reilly one time and he said, so rather sarcastically, you know, Bill, people give you a lot of credit for what you say, but they never give you enough credit for how loud and how often you say it. And it makes me laugh today, because the internet has essentially devolved into how often can we throw our message out there, and how loudly can we scream it from the rooftops. That is then considered authoritative argumentation. It boggles my mind.
I don't know if you follow many influencers, but one of the ones I follow simply because he's been taking over Reddit recently is Clavicular. And he got into a recent interview, I think it was about a month and a half ago, where they started asking him about topics of a political nature. And he was like, I'm not going to get into that, because if you want to talk about looks maxing, I'm going to talk about that, because they were specifically bringing up topics that were sensitive at that time. And he just refused to get into it. And then that exacerbated his followers, his realm, to look into his backstory, start asking that on his Twitch stream. I think he actually had to end the stream early because of that one specific topic. So the loudest people can be the most influential and become the most authoritative over time. Now,
yeah, certainly. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. This is classic kind of conspiracy theory stuff, right? And it's the bias there is availability bias, for instance. So, you know, if you were to be asked the question, is a plane crash more likely to occur than someone dying from getting, I don't know, stuck in a chimney? You would most likely say a plane crash, though statistically that may actually not be the case. But the reason is, no one ever hears about people getting stuck in a chimney and dying as a result. That information is not available to you, right? So we operate in this environment where, you know, the more we see things, the more it's pushed upon us, the more credence we give to it, the more we believe into it, irrespective of the fact that the chances of dying on a plane crash, though they do exist, are infinitesimal.
yes, and I talk about that all the time in my courses, where whenever a journalist writes up a story, it has to go through levels of review. So what looks better on a headline? Man gets stuck in chimney and has to dig himself out, or a plane crashes and kills 81. So that's one of those things that always comes up. But you did hit on a topic that we wanted to talk about today, which is cognitive biases.
Mm-hmm.
So these are things that analysts have to deal with every single day, whether it's a result of their upbringing, the specific institutions they've been a part of. Like, for example, we've all been in the military, so we have certain biases regarding that. But what techniques exist for us to help mitigate those biases? And can you kind of talk us through a few? Because we've used structured analytic techniques before, but we really haven't gone into them on our show.
Yeah. And so, yeah, this is one of my favorite topics, partly because I don't see anywhere near enough implementation of these techniques. On the one hand, that's, by the way, just my personal experience is another bias for you there to talk about. My personal experience isn't necessarily representative
Bias agrees with your bias.
The world as a whole, yeah. But secondly, because there's also a lot of discussion about the implementation of these techniques and the value that can be gained. And I love arguing kind of gray areas because the idea is that one learns based upon one's own argument and the other person's, and not necessarily about being right. So structured analytic techniques, these are essentially just concrete methodologies to be implemented at certain points of time to allow an investigator to explicitly reflect, introspect, elaborate upon evidence and check one's own cognitive reasoning, the evidentiary basis for certain decisions, making oneself aware of biases that exist in one's own rationale, be they, I have a particular bias towards seeing or focusing on person of interest data in my investigations because that's my primary background. I might steer away from cyber threat intelligence because my brain quickly overheats when we get into those technical topics. Or it may be because biases have been injected by other people, right? So I've taken over an investigation and the person who's given it to me has said, thus far we've identified John Smith. He's looking like a good candidate. Run the investigation further. And I have decided not to perform any kind of structured analytic techniques to check for fallacious reasoning or logical deficiencies in the investigation thus far. And I take it on goodwill. I say, okay, John Smith it is. Let's focus on him. And then 2 days later, it turns out he has nothing to do with the investigation and I've just wasted 2 days of work. So that's kind of the basis for structured analytic techniques and what they are. How we can actually use them, or what they are as it kind of relates to an individual, really depends. So they come down to a broad range of techniques. Some of them you absolutely already know, and I've kind of described them already. One of which is a key assumptions check. Literally just sitting down at the start of an investigation, whether or not you're creating it yourself or you've inherited it from someone else, and you run through what you currently understand about the investigation, and slightly more than that, what you assume or what you have internalized and inferred from the information that you have. And I should say, this key assumptions check is a fundamental for critical thinking and developing this kind of deeper level of thinking, but it's in no way restricted to open source intelligence. In fact, I was searching on Spotify for critical thinking in open source intelligence, and one of the podcasts that I landed on was about business. It was about a woman who was a business transformation specialist who, when a business was failing, she would get pulled in and she would transform the business. And she said, in her line of work, critical thinking is everything, and she always starts with a key assumptions check. So what do I understand thus far? What's been happening thus far? And this allows you to identify any of those biases that you have brought with you, any deficient reasoning that has been performed thus far, and essentially have as objective a starting point as possible going forward. Other ones that people may know are something like devil's advocacy, which just means, having someone systematically critique either your intelligence product, if you get to that stage, or what I typically do is I ask one of my colleagues to jump on a call with me and I speak to them. I explain my investigation. I talk through it, and I show them the evidentiary links that I've found, and I ask them to be as critical as possible. Why this person? Why does this data matter? How did you link these two disparate data points? What was the basis for that? Did you think about this other possibility? Which brings us to the standard third SAT, of which there are many, something like an argument of competing hypotheses. When I say why not potentially this situation, this hypothesis, that would be argument of competing hypotheses. So we don't just sit down and say we assume we know what's happening. It's definitely John Smith. He has this firearm. He's selling it in this area. We start to think, well, could it be someone else? Is there the possibility that they don't live in that geographic area? Maybe they're visiting as opposed to residing there. Are there other explanations that we could explore which would also fit our understanding of this picture without locking ourselves, with those blinkers on into what we either currently understand or we want to understand as the basis of the investigation? And there are many. If someone wants to get into structured analytic techniques, they don't have to buy a range of books. They can jump online and search for a Tradecraft primer, Structured Analytic Techniques for Improving Intelligence Analysis. This was developed by the US government in March 2009. It's freely available online, and it kind of is based upon Richard J. Hoyer's work about the psychology of intelligence analysis, and Randolph Fearson, both big powerhouses in the intelligence field. Get in, download the book. I've recommended it to governmental departments. I've recommended it to private investigators. It will be great learning. So those are, in a nutshell, he said, taking 20 minutes to explain very briefly, structured analytic techniques.
Mandatory reading for any IC analyst in the United States. DeCure's work on the Socratic method in intelligence analysis. It's now, at that time, considered groundbreaking, but now it's just a normal part of our everyday work. I do have a quick follow-up about SATs, and this is kind of a nuanced question based on your own experience, but do you feel that SATs, when a group of people use them all together, do they work better that way, or an individual conducts it and then results are shared so other people can attempt to replicate the work as well? Which works better in your experience?
So I would say it really depends on what kind of SAT you're looking to utilize and at what point in your investigation. Because some of them are geared towards that initial ideation phase, right? When you're starting to think about what is the current situation of investigation, right? So, if it's something like a terrorist attack that's taken place, right off the bat, you might start to consider, okay, is this one individual, multiple individuals? If this person is using a firearm, do they perhaps also have a vehicle available which they could, weaponize? Ideating, thinking through these possibilities, right? Competing hypotheses. Obviously, that would work better as a large group because everybody has their own particular background and experience. We find this that within my company as well, when we start talking about different use cases or situations, different customers and what they do, everybody understands that differently. But we throw it all in the pot and we develop this rather comprehensive, deep and broad understanding. Otherwise, sitting down one-on-one and running through devil's advocacy is fantastic. I would say that the benefit ultimately, and I will kind of yell this till the cows come home, is that these SATs, these processes, these methodologies shouldn't be utilized and forgotten, and they shouldn't be considered kind of singular moments. The most important thing that you can do is utilize an SAT, document it, action the results, and then run a retrospective and share that information. Don't hoard it. Don't create silos. Implement it as a standard practice with a feedback loop.
It is one of the things that we've implemented in my company where we start every new project with a brainstorming session. Everyone gets together, they just throw out random ideas. Then we do research, and we come back and get together with that same group, and then we do gap identification and further brainstorming.
A DIA has and they adapted it from Richard Shearer work. DIA is analytic design, and there's only one step in there where you perform SATs, necessarily a check the block. So I've been in the part of a more than one discussion when I was in the IC with DIA, and I asked him, "Did you run this again after you got this information in to see if it changed?" And they're like, "No, we never knew about that. So, but we're going to publish a product anyways." And I'm like, "Well, your analysis is wrong now because your information's 2 months old." But we could go down the rabbit hole all day long, but we want to get back to OSINT in general.
One last thing on the SATs is I love the devil advocacy one just because I love being overly critical of other people's work. So I'm really great at just asking, what's the purpose of that? Why did you do that?
Chris is great at that.
But this is the whole point. I mean, this is akin to, they always say about a coder, if you have an error being thrown in your code, put the little duck, beside your screen and start talking through everything. And I mentioned this right at the start. We utilize these techniques to make explicit what we understand, what we internalize, to be able to kind of, obviously bring to light not just what we're saying, but why we're saying it, identify those thought processes behind it. Otherwise, we have this tendency, and everybody does it, but we have this tendency of perhaps overestimating our own cognitive functions and assuming that we're working in a very logical, objective manner. And we assume that everything that we do is actually kind of based upon the previous step. But in reality, human beings are terrible at processing information or acting in a purely objective and logical manner. And they're terrible at multitasking and jumping between different topics and maintaining a rigid kind of concrete flow and process. There will be issues, and we need to accept the fact that there will be issues, and we need to attempt to mitigate them as best we can. It's not a shortcoming. It is hardwired into your psychology that you use these heuristics, right? These mental shortcuts, but we don't have to let them become a huge liability.
And terrible at self-evaluation.
And
Absolutely.
New information. Like, we need to understand that when we share results, people will be critical, and it's not a hit on your.
It's not a personal attack.
Yeah,
even though it may feel that way.
It's a part of where you're a part of a community at that point when you share results. So if somebody vehemently disagrees with you, that's a point to have a discussion, not sit there and call them names all day because, hey, they disagree with me.
But I think inherently in that there's the question of a certain degree of modesty or
humility,
self-awareness.
self-reflection.
Yeah, self-reflection, where you realize that you're not perfect and you can do better, and you need to be very honest with yourself and say that ultimately, and I express this upon attendees in my trainings all the time, because I can be, I don't know how you would describe it, a bit of a hard ass when people aren't paying attention, when they aren't performing. I end the training by saying, look, guys, I need you to be successful. I have a family, right? And you are police officers involved in myriad, very sensitive investigations. I want you to be as successful as possible to find, identify criminal activity, to apprehend these individuals, to do your jobs to the very best degree that you can. If this means that you have to sit there and be told that your work is not up to scratch, that you have to get better, that you made mistakes, chin up, say, yes, sir, I understand, I will do better, and then start improving. Because it's a journey, and ego and arrogance has no part in that, especially given the fact that, and I'll be the first person to say that, it's a hard job. There's a lot of data out there. There are new social media platforms every day. There are new types of data every day, tools every day. The learning does not stop, and you're not expected to be perfect. And this is why I hate the term expert, but you are expected to do your best and continue to develop.
What you're saying there actually leads perfectly into our next question. I've seen some of your webinars, and you've talked about the difference between all source intelligence and fusion intelligence. Can you go ahead and just define those and differentiate the two for us?
Yeah, so we've seen this interesting transition. We had intelligence used to more or less be broken down, depending on how you define it, into a bunch of different disciplines. We had covert intelligence, signals intelligence, measures intelligence, kind of 11 different intelligence disciplines, as it were. Then it kind of started shifting towards things like covert versus open source intelligence, or publicly available intelligence and commercially available intelligence, kind of restricted or open or severely restricted. Now we've seen this transition away from utilizing those kinds of definitions. In fact, in Heather Williams's paper in 2017 called Defining Second Generation Open Source Intelligence for the Defense Enterprise, fantastic paper that people should read, she stated that the definitions are actually counterproductive. They create these barriers, these kind of these borders between. What we need to do is consolidate. So we need to start moving towards what we started to do was all source intelligence, where we realize that every different intelligence discipline has value to add to an investigation, not just in an additive kind of manner, but really in a compounding manner. So, geolocation data is fantastic if we can intercept, I don't know, signals from a particular carrier, and then use social media through open source intelligence to identify where a particular individual ate dinner the night before, or all of these different things. So that was all source intelligence. Bearing in mind that one of the key factors as well was breaking down silos. We have organizations and even individuals within organizations who are very competitive, who want to restrict access to their data, who aren't working in a particularly collaborative environment. I had a discussion, I think a couple of years ago, with a gentleman, Kevin Metcalf, a well-known individual in the child protection field, a great advocate for investigating law enforcement, who, as he told me, one of the issues is you have two different teams competing for the same budget. And you don't want to share your investigative results with them or your data with the other team, because if they win, quote unquote, their budget goes up and yours goes down. Right? It's a zero-sum game. But what we saw was all source intelligence means we share across teams, departments, organizations, and into academia, into private enterprise. And now we've gotten to that point where fusion intelligence essentially means everything and anything. It's all manner of individuals, all manner of data sources, essentially saying, this age-old competitiveness between open source or covert, what is better, what is cooler, is irrelevant. All data is valuable when it is contextualized, when it's kind of linked to other data points, and everybody has something to add. Where I look at certain investigations that I have run, where I have found interesting pieces of information that I've only understood based upon my knowledge of history, my knowledge of kind of cultural backgrounds in a particular geographic area, that is something that perhaps a professor of could bring to the table. Not necessarily someone who's on my team, who's sitting in my fusion center, but someone who has value to add to an investigation because of their background. They add value, they contextualize, they allow me to infer meaning from data that I otherwise wouldn't have. So, as I said, the too long didn't read is we've gone from compartmentalized, individual, defined for the sake of defining things, to we need everything. The world is very complex. Everybody has something to add, and ultimately the end result is a successful investigation. Now, that's also very optimistic, I should say. Competitiveness will still exist.
With that increased access to data, using the human to contextualize it while using, whatever other methods to gather that data, I think we got to find a better balance in that process.
Yeah, so the issue is time. well, we've talked about AI, not to a great degree, but very, very briefly. But no one has time. So when we talk about data availability, we start looking at automations that make the collection process as fast and clean and easy as possible. But the problem there is this huge amount of noise that comes in because you're just collecting as much as you can. Philip Lowenthal, actually, in his book, Intelligence, 9th edition, so it's Intelligence, I think, from Secrets to Policy, talks about the wheat versus chaff problem, where not necessarily the analysts themselves, but the decision makers, the heads of teams, believe that the more data that you ingest, the better your results will be. But that's not the case. What you really need is somebody, preferably a human analyst, who has an understanding of the investigation, the background, who can perceive it and infer meaning, is the person that's in charge of actually that executive decision to pull in certain data points, even before you get to really processing and analyzing and obviously disseminating that information ultimately. But it's a lot of information. And it's a lot of investigations that you receive on short notice with very short turnaround that just need to be done. And it's a huge, huge challenge in the modern open source intelligence environment.
Going back to your comment on funding between two departments, one of the things I've always talked about is that capitalism should have no place when it comes to critical thinking and sharing of information. But unfortunately, it gets in the way of a lot of things. We'll leave it there because I don't want to go down the rabbit hole regarding different mentalities of government practitioners. So one of the things I wanted to get back was you specifically. You have experience with threat intelligence, digital forensics. We talked about that a little bit before we started today. Can you tell us a little about your experiences there, maybe even some stories that you have to share, and how open source intelligence can contribute to those practices?
Yeah, so, I mean, when we talk about cyber threat intelligence, huge topic. I've had experience looking into, and I should, add the caveat that I don't, as I said earlier, consider myself a technical guy. If I have very, very technical questions, I usually head over to one of my colleagues and ask the question in a very simple manner and receive a huge amount of information in return.
Did you just ask Tim?
Just ask Tim? Yeah. You're my next port of call. I have your email address, so beware. But cyber threat intelligence, one of the, and I should say, I've been kind of framing my responses based upon tools that are utilized just to kind of collect and process, analyze data. But if we're talking about cyber threat intelligence, malware or ransomware or different groups of threat actors, we can pursue those investigations in a couple of different ways. We can go pure IT infrastructure. So we can use the malware hashes and we can try to resolve them back through data partners to different groups. Or we can look at the MITRE ATT&CK databases for information there. Or we can even do real-time monitoring, right? So we can set up, utilizing various tools, the tool of your choice, monitors to detect any kind of anomalous communications relating to DDoS attacks or attempts to phish different individuals or deploy malware or anything like this. Open source intelligence provides a huge amount of value because it's very replicable. We can utilize the same tools for a range of different investigations. In terms of the cost-benefit analysis, it essentially, kind of how we operate is we have various data partners whose business model it is to collect and process and make available this type of information that we can then consolidate into our environment and further analyze for our particular investigative needs. For data, digital forensics, this becomes a little bit of a tricky one when we talk about open source intelligence. My background in that particular field was taking devices for, I guess, in pursuance to certain legal proceedings and copying that data and forensically kind of ensuring that that data was available for subsequent processing phases. But what you can do with open source intelligence is extract a huge amount of data from devices. And this could be, images, these could be communications, these could be metadata, geo-tracking, location data. Ad intelligence, for instance, is a new topic that's come up recently that I've slowly trained myself to better understand, where we can use data from apps and software on a device that we've gathered in a purely legal and forensically sound manner to see where a device was at a particular point in time, what its activity was, so on and so forth. Now, I said that these were open source intelligence investigations, and you guys mentioned that as well. We really start moving into the constraints of data when we talk about that. So is it open and available, all of this data? Certainly not. Is some of it semi-open and available? Yes. I mean, I'm reminded of things like breach data, compromised records, that type of thing, kind of available, just depending on how hard you look for it. However, other data is not available to your regular individual. You would have to, have a little bit of budget available to reach out to these data partners and request access to their data, which brings me to my final thoughts, because I know that I have a tendency of waffling on somewhat, is I just want to mention that when we talk about open source intelligence, and certainly practitioners, right, investigators, we're talking about such a broad spectrum of individuals. And when we talk about the intelligence community, or those people operating in this community, we're talking about people who have completely different backgrounds, access to completely different tools and different ways of investigating. And it's something that we probably shouldn't forget. Not everyone's out there racing a Mercedes. Some people are just pottering along in the old, Volkswagen Golf that their grandmother had, but they're still doing the very best that they have. Or that they can, rather.
And it does really depend on the field that you're coming from. Because when you talk to a defense analyst versus a law enforcement analyst versus a journalist, their definitions of what open source intelligence is, can be, and was, those all drastically change over time. And one of the things I do want to hit on when you're talking about ad intelligence was how you can start thinking, I guess, not outside of the box, because everybody has their own boxes, right? You're talking about heuristics and their own inherent biases. It's more ways to bring in light into the box so you can understand it. And you can probably add on to this. I was thinking about ways to use all that telemetry data that we're getting from devices better, so we can get warnings and indications rather than just trying to find out what happened after the fact. And I was like, hey, guys, they're hitting us every single day at this specific time. They were doing airstrike sorties into our area of operations. I go like, they need people to do that, right? And they just kind of stared at me and said, what do you mean? I was like, they need a pilot, they need an air traffic controller, commander needs to approve it, they need to have mechanics on stations. What if we just find those devices and figure out where they sleep at, and we just get their sleeping pattern, so I know when they wake up for work, the sorties are going to begin on this day. So it's just thinking about these little tiny data points, bringing them together, and hopefully coming to the right answer. But you're absolutely right.
That's fascinating, because something I had a customer ask me 3 days ago, based on our tool, right? We have data sources, myriad data sources, not all of which are open and available out of the box, essentially. And they said, cool. We have all of this kind of data, foundational stuff. That's great. But can you recommend other integrations that would be helpful? And I said, no, for two reasons. One, I don't think you're ready, right? You need to walk before you can run, right? More integrations, more data, more complexity, more chaos. And this is why I'm such a proponent of identifying the way that you think, preparing for your investigations, having structure, having a concrete approach, because the only way to combat that chaos, and open source intelligence is chaos without end, is by bringing order. So I said, no, you're not ready for it. And the second thing is, what is value right? So the situation you just described there, for some people, the time that these gentlemen get out of bed and start their day is completely irrelevant. But for you, it's a very valuable piece of information based upon what your particular investigative goal is, what the question is that you are asking, because it serves to answer that specific question. And it's very fun to have these discussions because it forces you to understand that the nature of the question that you ask is supremely important to start to define the value of the data that would answer that question, right? And we talk about AI and we talk about the human analyst. It's the human that has to start asking those questions and understand, even I was looking through one of my books here, what is a good question? Can it be answered? Can it be answered in a timely fashion? Does it allow for expansion? Does it allow for subcomponents? Does it allow for the investigator to know when is enough, right? Have I found sufficient information without spending a week going down this rabbit hole, which is just a waste of time? The framing is super important. So, as I said, I said to these particular attendees, no, I really can't suggest anything, and I wouldn't. But if you come back in 6 months' time, and you can show me that you can drive this car, then we can start talking about taking it out on the racetrack and really getting stuck in. Otherwise, you're going to trip yourself up.
A while since I've had a discussion about target systems analysis, but one of the things you have to understand is the center of gravity for any given topic. So I'd like to think when we're thinking about cyber threat intelligence and open source intelligence, rather than focusing on the device, the machine, or methodology, it's actually there always be a human being behind something that's happening. And that's naturally where my mind gravitates to, because I've had questions like, hey, I only see that they're using one SIM card slot on their phone because I got called out of records back. Why aren't they using the other SIM slot? Like, are they hiding it that well? And I'm like, no, they probably bought the phone and just didn't know there's another SIM slot in it. It was cheap. And then analyst just looked at me and goes like, I didn't think about that. So my mind always goes back to what a human being would do naturally every single day. It's, these people over time, they didn't just, kind of fall into being a expert practitioner of spycraft. When you're 5 years old, you're not like, I'm going to grow up and be a government analyst. I'm going to grow up and be a spy for a foreign nation. You're like, you just naturally gather education experience over time. But I don't want to go too deep into that. I love talking about it, and I'll take over the conversation. I need to give Chris some time to talk.
No, it's good. I like listening to you. I want to point out that the philosopher in me really appreciates the fact that, Tim, you said bring light into your box. I think it's a great turn of phrase for how we can get outside of our own thinking. All right. I want to ask you, what are some starting points and recommendations that you have for people new to OSINT? And then what's some advice that you have for seasoned investigators?
So for people that are new to open source intelligence, I would say you have to understand exactly what kind of perspective you're coming from. So, and by that I mean, what is your background? What are your interests? What are your general capabilities, right? Because I'm never going to be an Olympic swimmer. Right, I'm just not cut out for it. I need to know kind of where I'm positioned and where I can be successful. So maybe that's in a security incident event management kind of center, or maybe that's someone that's working for a private company running open source intelligence investigations, or a journalist, right? Lots of different fields. You would have to understand kind of where potentially you could move into and where you see yourself. And after that, it's very much understanding what is your knowledge, what is your experience thus far, what are deficiencies in what you know about the topic and about the tools and about the ideas. I wouldn't suggest that people jump on LinkedIn and spend too much time involved in any of the posts about open source intelligence. I have a love-hate relationship with LinkedIn because I see the word cheat sheet and best tools and expert investigator thrown around way too often.
I want to piggyback on that. All of these, when you say cheat sheets, these graphics, and then people will go through and tag all these companies just to get engagement. Like, I understand the appeal behind that because it is social media and it's meant for engagement, but don't go out there and karma farm. Actually bring something to the conversation. That's just, ugh.
Yeah, there's a lot of I'm not sure what the politically correct term is, but it involves people essentially in a circle congratulating one another in turn, right?
Oh.
It's, I'll like your post if you like my post. You know, couldn't have said it better myself, that kind of thing. Self-congratulatory marketing, essentially. But it gives a bad view, it gives a bad understanding of open source intelligence, because I think if people are starting out, the best thing they can do is not focus on tools and not focus on the hardcore kind of software coding, hacking aspect of it. And I'm not saying that it's the right approach. I'm just saying it's my way that I would encourage people. It's developing the fundamentals, right? It's starting to think about thought processes. And like I said about data, I like to pull up when I'm doing trainings a Sherlock Holmes story, Arthur Conan Doyle, right? It's I think Drama in Bohemia, I think is the name of it, some such. It's the first book, and Holmes receives a letter, and he reads through this letter, and Watson says, "Okay, it's rather odd. This gentleman wants to meet with you." And Holmes says, "Yes, but you know, who sent it? You know, what's going on?" And he starts to just look through this letter, the quality of the paper, a certain watermark or imprint, the language that's being used. You know, he at one point he reads out Holmes' reviews of you I have from all quarters received, and he says, it must be a German. No proper Englishman or Frenchman would ever so abuse a verb. All of these things are this kind of approach to open source intelligence, I think, is hugely beneficial because it's thinking about thinking and thinking about what you're seeing and asking questions that lie beneath, right? Before you get into too technical a topic, even though it is a field. So that's what I would say for beginners. Just learn basics, learn about information processing, understanding the cognitive functions, structured analytic techniques, if you like, learn about philosophy and different biases that exist, you know, non sequiturs for your arguments. You know, we talked earlier about kind of the way that people think. Look into deficiencies of cognitive function. And for experts, I would honestly say the same. I'm not a fan of the term expert, certainly. For me, that's someone that has, you know, 30, 40 years in the field. For open source intelligence, even that isn't the particularly good criterion for expertise, because open source intelligence 30 or 40 years ago was completely different to what it is today. And dare I say that the development of open source intelligence as an idea and a concept is increasingly is changing at an increasingly fast pace. The problem is, for experts, he says as though he's an expert, experts tend to lock into their understanding of what they do and what they've always done. They seem to think that because they have a gut instinct that must be correct because they have experience with certain topics. So I would say for practiced practitioners and experts, probably more valuable now than ever to engage with critical thinking and take some responsibility. If you have new people joining your team, they need to know what you know. You can't leave after 40 years on the job, go home, kick up your feet in retirement. That's 40 years of knowledge lost. The number of people that I've talked to in my time training on open source intelligence who do not take notes, who do not share notes, who do not consolidate their understanding. I mean, Hoyer is a great example. His psychology of intelligence analysis began as internal memos that he would send out within the CIA. And at a point later on, he thought, hey, it'd be great if we consolidated these, put them into essentially a learning resource and distributed these. because it takes too long to train people or to have people generate their own self-experience. We need a knowledge base. We need a learning curriculum internal for people. So yeah, don't be selfish. Write stuff down. Don't just be that guy that can do everything, but no one knows how it works. The magician in the cellar. Share that information with everybody else. You have a responsibility to do so.
Center for the Studies for Intelligence, excellent resource from the CIA. A lot of their information, I would say more than 70% of it is classified, but that 25% is fascinating reading for anyone. And I do want to commend you on keeping this entire conversation agnostic for everyone, because a lot of people, they tend to go like, hey, get on Google. And I'm like, well, Google's a resource. Like, tell us how you're using that search engine, why it's very specific. So I do want to say thank you for keeping the whole conversation agnostic. And one of the things that I do want to just compliment you on is talking about critical thinking in such a way that when you do apply some of your asides and segues, the Arthur Conan Doyle, I think, was a fantastic commentator on the human condition and how sociology fits in everything, because Holmes was fantastic in seeing the general and the specific, and specific in the general, which is a core component of any sociology major. So just fascinating carrying all that together.
Yeah. All right. So you went to Massey University with Fergus the Ram as a mascot. And then,
is it? I didn't even know that.
So apparently he just shows up everywhere. Or Fergus just shows up everywhere. So I was doing some research into notable people that went to the same university, and like 60% of them were rugby players. So I have two questions for that. One, does everybody in New Zealand have to play rugby?
Okay. I can answer that very quickly.
Yeah.
Rugby is a hugely important topic in New Zealand, and it is ingrained in New Zealand culture. When I was 5 years old, my father marched me down to the local rugby club for weigh-in night. I got weighed. I got put, because I was a skinny wee lad, into a team of skinny wee lads, and from there on out, it was expected that you would play rugby. Rugby in the winter, cricket in the summer. That was just it.
Yeah, it was football for me, being from the southeastern United States. And then
so essentially, yes.
Go ahead.
No, it's everybody plays rugby. It's our hallmark. I mean, rugby and the Lord of the Rings. Those are essentially just the two exports of New Zealand.
And then my follow-up question, of course, the rugby team, the national rugby team, is named the All Blacks, or nicknamed the All Blacks because of their uniforms. So then they nicknamed the national basketball team for New Zealand the Tar Blacks.
Yes.
So is there, or are there plans to have a national team of jockeys called the Small Blacks?
So the problem is, when you start this kind of this methodology, if we're talking about methodologies of naming conventions, invariably you land in issues where you find that the outcome is not particularly palatable. So, what would you call the New Zealand badminton team? Dare I say they would probably be the Blackhawks, right?
Oh, well, yeah. That's so much better than what I came up with.
We might have to cut that, but
no, that's staying.
No, it's
I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, the national women's netball team are the Silver Ferns, so we like to keep it very simple.
Oh, they branched out.
Yeah. Was that an inadvertent pun, by the way?
No, that was a
fern pun.
Yeah, no, that was I was there.
No, but yeah, very simple. The All Blacks, greatest sports team of all time. Look it up.
I mean, they are, and they won, I think, the first national or international rugby World Cup or whatever. And then the other thing I learned about New Zealand is it was the first self-governing nation to allow women to vote.
Yeah, so that's interesting, actually, because New Zealand, whilst being worlds away on the other side of the planet, and I cannot stress how far away from everything New Zealand is kind of oddly forward thinking, and I'm not saying perfect by any stretch of the imagination. But yeah, has been kind of pretty modern, pretty open to equality and government transparency and I don't know, cultural acceptance. It's lovely.
The Christchurch shooting that happened there,
Mm.
while a tragedy, promoted one of the most drastic changes in governance that happened. Every citizen came together and said, "Hey, why do we need these high capacity weapons?
Mm.
We need to get rid of them because we don't want this to happen ever again." So I think it was more than 95% of the citizens who had access to firearms or high capacity weapons gladly handed over them to their local law enforcement and said, "Do what you can with these." And when I bring that up in my trainings in the United States, it is one of the most fascinating talking points because of our Second Amendment, right? I've actually seen people in Canada and the UK have Second Amendment stickers, and I'm like, dude, you don't even have that. Like, so it's fascinating bringing that up.
Yeah, so that was one of the kind of the interesting outcomes, the sense of I don't know what you'd even say, like in the political sphere, this true kind of altruistic approach to political governance and I guess like public responsibility, civic duty, even if I can be overly poetic, where people said, and I should reflect this upon our Australian brothers as well. There was a massacre in Australia in was it Port Arthur, I think it was a couple of decades ago, and essentially the Australian government pushed through sweeping firearm reform, which was to say you could still own a firearm, but you need to register it. They had a buyback program and everything like that. So yeah, great to see New Zealand kind of looking after itself, and that was my hometown, Christchurch. Actually, I distinctly remember when I got the news that a shooting had occurred. I was standing outside of the office of my previous employer when I was a consultant, taken aback, absolutely taken aback that something like that could occur, shocked. However, I should say there have been not just positive outcomes in terms of legislation pertaining to the ownership of not just firearms, but large capacity magazines and different attachments, but also the fact that the event was live streamed has had an impact upon investigations and which occurs here in Europe. So I had the pleasure recently of traveling to Manchester, and I gave a presentation on the future of open source intelligence at the Manchester Police headquarters whilst they were doing a workshop for 2 days, talking about use cases, things they'd been through, about new developments. This is where I learned more information about their counterterrorism fusion centers. Just fascinating how they have it operated. But they've set up a particular initiative that allows for monitoring live streams and video as a source of data. And the catalyst was this terrorist attack in New Zealand, which was live streamed. But they've had huge success. One of the cases they had was an individual who was suffering from mental issues, emotional disturbance, was live streaming, and said that they were very much considering consuming a large bottle of medication and setting themselves up in an open window. But they utilize this new capability whereby individuals can report content, and they have partnerships with different platforms where content such as that is immediately flagged and then escalated through the platform itself to emergency response centers. So I don't question me, please, too closely on the exact details, but it was something like within 20 minutes, an ambulance had arrived at that particular residence, though it was, elsewhere in the UK, and the individual received care, attention that they needed. That was a very short-term kind of quick turnaround. Another incident was not even within the UK, but in Eastern Europe. An individual was posting live streaming about bringing various bladed weapons to their school in order to undertake an attack. On the day that they stated that they would do so, they eventually didn't go through with the attack. They postponed it to the day after, and they were arrested and held the day after as they entered the school by local police officers and law enforcement. And to think that is indeed possible, that it is possible for cooperative arrangements to be set up utilizing open source intelligence, right? Live stream video in cooperation with these different platforms and with these different authorities in order to action that intelligence, right? Because lots of people like to talk about intelligence and think that it's very, very cool. One of the core requirements is that it is as it relates to timeliness, right? If I don't get the information that I need in the time frame that I need it, it's just rubbish. So they could disseminate this intelligence product that they created, inform local law enforcement. They had to geolocate where this school was in the first instance. They did it from floor patterns or something, a mosaic on the floor, something like this. Wild stuff. And the attack was averted. And I'll tell you what, I used to sleep okay when I was a consultant, copying data, from 20 mobile devices a day. But I sleep really well after hearing stories like that and knowing that open source intelligence investigations are keeping people safe, that they are identifying, like you said, about not just reacting after the fact, but they are identifying individuals whose aim it is to undertake a particular attack and cause harm to individuals, and making sure that those attacks don't go through. It feels good.
It is a fascinating note to end on. The tenacity that some OSINT investigators have just go beyond what I would ever imagine, because I'm a fairly, I guess, stubborn individual when it comes to my investigations. I get frustrated really, really quickly, and I'm like, oh, screw this, but some people, they literally don't give up, and they will follow every single rabbit and the hole they go down and come up with conclusions that I had never come to. But Chris, do you have any final parting thoughts?
Not really. I just wanted to say thank you for being a part of this. Thank you for listening to our questions and just being really smart and knowledgeable, thinking about thinking. That's one of my favorite things to think about.
I love smart people.
Well, I would say this. I appreciate the compliment. Anyone that is listening, though, should absolutely question everything that I've said, right? Go out, look up your own sources, read the books that I've referenced, look at these structured analytic techniques, because that is exactly the point, right? Don't take what I say at face value. Decide for yourself what is important to you. Start that learning journey. I mentioned earlier about SATs. Some people argue that they're not particularly helpful, but in discussing why they may not be helpful, you start doing, running through those critical thinking exercises. So even if you think that I'm absolutely full of noise and nothing of value, the fact that you are engaging, that you are creating your own argument against what I'm saying, means that you are learning and you are improving. So do that, have fun, and let's just try to do the best damn job that we can out there.
Not only does an answer have value, the question does too, because if you can't answer it, you then provide yourself information, and you want to go out there and find other things. So why is one of the most critical questions you could ever ask yourself if you actually have meaning attached to it.
What's the purpose of that? That's the question I ask all the time. What's the point of that?
I was going to say one of the core points actually that Fierson and Hoyer themselves say is that whilst it's important to identify what the conclusions were of a particular investigation, more important is the how did I arrive at those conclusions.
Yep, big component of the Socratic method throughout all of their teachings, making it replicable so people can understand it and explaining it. That needs to happen too. But thank you guys so much for listening. If you've made it this far throughout this fascinating episode, I think Aaron, Chris, and I could go on another 2 to 3 hours just
easily
talking about talking and thinking. But if you liked our content, please share. Comment below if you'd like to see more content like this. And this has been the OSINT Output with Chris and Tim.
Tim and Chris and Aaron.
Thanks, man.
Thanks, guys. Pleasure.